On September 2nd, 1752, millions of British and American colonists went to sleep. They woke up on September 14th. 11 days were gone, not lost, not misplaced, deleted by an act of Parliament from the official record of time itself. And the people who lost those days never got them back. This is not a theory. It is not a disputed historical claim. It is one of the most thoroughly documented administrative events in the history of the English-speaking world. The British Calendar Act of 1750, officially the Calendar New Style Act, was passed by Parliament on May 22, 1751. It received royal assent from King George II. It was printed in full in the London Gazette. It was read from pulpits across England and announced in colonial newspapers from Boston to Williamsburg. The act mandated the adoption of the Gregorian calendar, the system used by most of Catholic Europe since 1582, in place of the Julian calendar that Britain and its colonies had used for over 1,000 years. The practical consequence was this: the Julian calendar had accumulated an 11-day discrepancy from the solar year. To correct it, 11 days had to be removed. The act specified that the day after September 2nd, 1752, would be called September 14th. Everything that happened between those two dates, in the official record, did not happen. There was no September 3rd, no September 4th, no September 5th through 13th. Those dates do not exist in the British or American calendar of 1752. The documents proving this are in the Parliamentary Archives in London, in the Colonial Assembly records of every American colony, and in the personal papers of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who wrote about it at the time. What those documents also show is that the official explanation for why this happened, and the official account of how people responded, is considerably simpler than the reality. I found this while researching birth and death records from colonial America. I was looking at parish registers from Virginia in the 1750s, trying to understand how ordinary people documented their lives before civil registration existed. When I kept running into entries that made no sense, births recorded on dates that do not exist, deaths recorded on September 7th, 1752. A date that was officially deleted from the calendar. Marriages solemnized on September 10th of the same year. Legal contracts signed and witnessed on dates that Parliament had declared never happened. I assumed at first that these were errors, clerks making mistakes in the confusion of the transition. But the more records I examined, the more I realized these were not errors. These were people refusing, quietly, in their own records, in their own communities, to accept that the government had the authority to delete days from their lives. And the legal consequences of that refusal lasted for generations. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what was replaced. The Julian calendar was introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE. It divided the year into 365 days, with a leap year every 4 years, a system elegant in its simplicity and slightly wrong in its mathematics. The solar year is not exactly 365.25 days. It is 365.2422 days. The difference is small, 11 minutes per year, but it accumulates. By 1752, the Julian calendar was 11 days behind the solar year. The spring equinox, which should fall on March 21st, was falling on March 10th. Easter, calculated from the equinox, was drifting further from its intended astronomical position every century. The Gregorian calendar, introduced by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582, corrected this by removing 3 leap years every 400 years. Catholic Europe adopted it immediately. Protestant Europe refused, not because the mathematics were wrong, but because the Pope had proposed it. Britain and its colonies therefore spent 170 years using a calendar they knew was wrong rather than adopt a correction proposed by Rome. By 1750, the discrepancy had become practically impossible to ignore. British merchants doing business with European counterparts operated on different dates. International correspondence required constant conversion. Legal documents involving parties in different countries carried dates that meant different things to different signatories. Parliament finally acted. The Calendar Act passed. 11 days were scheduled for deletion. What Parliament did not fully anticipate was what those 11 days meant to the people who were about to lose them. The 11 deleted days were not empty days. They were days in which people had been born, married, contracted debts, signed leases, celebrated festivals, planted crops, and expected to be paid. The legal consequences were immediate and severe. Rent. In 1752, the majority of English and colonial tenants paid rent on quarterly term days, specific dates in the calendar that had fixed legal significance. The deletion of 11 days meant that the quarter days fell 11 days earlier in the solar year than they had the previous year. Landlords demanded rent on the new calendar dates. Tenants argued they owed rent on the old dates, that their leases, signed under the Julian calendar, entitled them to 11 additional days before payment was due. The legal disputes this generated filled English courts for years. The parliamentary record contains dozens of petitions from tenant associations arguing that the Calendar Act had effectively shortened their leases without compensation. Parliament's response was to include a provision in the Act stating that annual payments falling due on specific dates would be adjusted to maintain the same interval from the solar year. In practice, this provision was interpreted differently by different courts in different counties, and the disputes continued regardless. Wages. Workers paid by the week or month faced the same problem in reverse. If a worker was paid monthly and the month of September 1752 contained only 19 days instead of 30, did they receive a full month's wages or 19/30ths of a month's wages? The Act did not specify. Employers and workers reached different conclusions. The strikes and work stoppages that resulted were reported in London newspapers throughout the autumn of 1752. Birthdays. This is the detail that the official histories mention briefly and then set aside, but which deserves more attention than it receives. Every person born between September 3rd and September 13th of any year, not just 1752, but any year in the Julian calendar, had a birthday that no longer existed in the new calendar. Those dates had been deleted not just from 1752, but from the calendar permanently. September 3rd through 13th exist today, but they now fall 11 days later in the solar year than they did before 1752. A person born on September 7th under the Julian calendar could argue that their birthday was now either September 7th on the new calendar, which fell 11 days later in the solar year than the day of their birth, or September 18th on the new calendar, which fell on the same solar day as their original birthday, but carried a different date. There was no official answer. The Calendar Act did not address birthdays. Courts in different jurisdictions reached different conclusions when the question arose in legal contexts: inheritance disputes, age of majority determinations, pension eligibility calculations. Some people chose one date, some chose the other, some refused to choose and continued to observe their birthdays on the old calendar date for the rest of their lives, passing the confusion to their children and grandchildren. The standard historical account of public reaction to the calendar change includes a phrase that appears in almost every textbook treatment of the subject: "Give us our 11 days." This phrase is attributed to rioters who took to the streets to protest the deletion of 11 days from their lives. It has become a shorthand for the confusion and anger that accompanied the transition, cited briefly, treated as a colorful historical footnote, and then set aside. The reality documented in contemporary sources is more complex and more serious than the textbook version suggests. The riots of 1752 and 1753 were not simply about confusion over dates. They were about money, about legal rights, and about the fundamental question of whether a government had the authority to alter the measurement of time itself, and to do so in ways that transferred wealth from tenants and workers to landlords and employers. The Gentleman's Magazine, published in London throughout this period, reported disturbances in at least 14 English counties in the autumn of 1752. The reports describe not random crowds shouting about dates, but organized groups of workers and tenants presenting specific legal grievances about wages and rents. A petition presented to Parliament in February 1753, signed by over 3,000 residents of Lincolnshire, argued that the Calendar Act had resulted in an effective transfer of 11 days' rent from tenants to landlords in a single year, and requested either compensation or a return to the old calendar. Parliament rejected the petition. The official response, recorded in Hansard, stated that the mathematical correction of the calendar was a matter of scientific necessity, and that individual financial grievances, while understandable, could not override the public interest in calendar accuracy. The petitioners did not find this answer satisfying. Their descendants, in some cases, continued to observe the old calendar dates for festivals, rents, and legal obligations well into the 19th century. A parallel calendar system operating quietly beneath the official one in communities that had decided the government's authority over time had its limits. The deleted days created a permanent anomaly in the historical record that researchers encounter to this day. Parish registers, the birth, marriage, and death records kept by Church of England parishes and their colonial equivalents, show the transition with startling clarity. In parish after parish, the register moves from September 2nd directly to September 14th. The 11 days between those dates contain no entries because, officially, they did not exist. But not all registers made that jump cleanly. The Virginia Colonial Records Project, a systematic digitization of colonial Virginia documents completed in the 1990s, identified over 400 parish register entries from the period 1752 to 1760 that carry dates falling within the deleted 11 days. September 5th, September 9th, September 12th. Dates that Parliament had declared did not exist, recorded by parish clerks who either didn't receive the notice, didn't accept it, or didn't care. The people recorded on those dates, baptized, married, or buried on days that officially never happened, occupy a peculiar position in the historical record. Their existence is documented. The date of their documentation is, by the official calendar, impossible. Genealogists working with colonial American records regularly encounter this problem. A person's birth is recorded on September 8, 1752. That date does not exist in the official calendar. The birth happened. The record survived. The date is a ghost. The legal implications extended further than genealogy. Age of majority determinations, inheritance calculations, pension eligibility assessments, all of these required knowing a person's exact birth date. For people born in the deleted 11 days, or born before 1752, and celebrating birthdays that now fell in a different relationship to the solar year, the answer was genuinely unclear. Court records from the late 18th and early 19th century contain multiple cases in which the question of a person's legal age turned on the interpretation of a Julian calendar birth date in a Gregorian world. The courts reached inconsistent conclusions. Some held that the Julian date controlled. Others converted to Gregorian. Others appointed commissioners to investigate the specific facts of each case individually. The last known legal dispute in England in which a Julian calendar birth date was argued before a court was resolved in 1834, 82 years after the calendar change. The most famous American casualty of the calendar change is a case that most Americans know about without knowing why it matters. George Washington was born on February 11th, 1731, under the Julian calendar. When the Gregorian calendar was adopted in 1752, his birthday, like every other date before September 14th of that year, shifted. Under the Gregorian system, February 11th, 1731. Julian corresponds to February 22nd, 1731. Gregorian. Washington himself chose to celebrate his birthday on February 22nd. This Gregorian equivalent from 1752 onward. He noted this choice explicitly in his diary. He was aware that he had, in a technical sense, 2 birthdays, and he chose the one that aligned with the corrected calendar. This is why Washington's birthday is celebrated on February 22nd and why President's Day falls when it does. The date was determined not by the day he was born, but by a parliamentary act passed 21 years after his birth. Washington was prominent enough that his choice was documented and remembered. Millions of ordinary Americans made the same choice, or the opposite choice, or no choice at all, and left no record of it. The colonial records that survive show enormous variation in how individuals handled the transition. Some adopted the new calendar immediately and completely. Some continued to observe old calendar dates for religious festivals and personal anniversaries, while using the new calendar for legal and commercial purposes. Some ignored the change entirely for years, continuing to date their personal correspondence and diary entries with Julian dates long after the official transition. The result is a generation of Americans whose personal chronology exists in 2 parallel systems that cannot always be reconciled, and whose descendants, doing genealogical research 2.5 centuries later, regularly discover that the dates they thought they knew about their ancestors are 11 days off from the dates their ancestors actually experienced. The calendar change created particular complications in the American colonies that the parliamentary debates in London had not fully anticipated. Communication between London and the colonies took weeks. The Calendar Act was passed in May 1751 and took effect in September 1752, giving colonial administrators approximately 16 months to prepare. In practice, many colonial communities received notice considerably later, and some received it with insufficient time to make the legal and administrative adjustments the transition required. The Massachusetts Bay Colony records show that the Boston Town Meeting of August 1752 spent considerable time debating how to handle outstanding legal obligations, court dates, tax deadlines, debt payments that fell within the deleted 11 days. The minutes of that meeting, held in the Massachusetts archives, describe a genuine administrative crisis. Legal deadlines that had been set months in advance now either fell on deleted dates or required interpretation that the colonial courts had no precedent for providing. The solution adopted in Massachusetts, and in most other colonies, was to treat obligations falling within the deleted 11 days as falling due on September 14th, the first date of the new calendar. This resolved the immediate crisis, but created new inequities. Creditors whose debts were due on September 7th found themselves waiting until September 14th, while debtors whose obligations fell on September 13th found themselves required to pay a day earlier than they had planned. In the southern colonies, the calendar transition intersected with the agricultural calendar in ways that created lasting confusion. Crop planting and harvest dates embedded in lease agreements and labor contracts were tied to calendar dates that now fell 11 days later in the solar year. Tobacco planting schedules, timed to the last frost, had been calibrated over generations to specific calendar dates. Those calibrations were now wrong, or rather, they were right by the old calendar and wrong by the new one, and nobody was entirely sure which calendar controlled. Plantation records from Virginia and South Carolina from the 1750s through the 1770s show a transitional period in which agricultural entries are sometimes dated by the old calendar, sometimes by the new, and sometimes by both simultaneously, with notations like March 15th OS for Old Style and March 26th NS for New Style, appearing in the same document. The abbreviations OS and NS, Old Style and New Style, appear in American documents throughout the late 18th century. They are still used by historians today when citing dates from the transition period. They are a permanent reminder that for a generation of Americans, time itself came in two versions, and choosing between them was a daily act with real consequences. Not everyone accepted the new calendar. The most visible refusals were religious. Several Protestant denominations in England and the colonies continued to observe Christmas on January 6th, the old calendar date, rather than December 25th. This practice, known as Old Christmas, persisted in some American communities well into the 20th century. In parts of Appalachia, Old Christmas was still being observed in living memory. The Quakers, who had their own objections to the names of months and days as derived from pagan sources, adopted a numbering system for months that created additional complications during the transition period. Their records from the 1750s use numerical month designations that require careful interpretation to determine whether they follow the old or new calendar. But the most systematic refusals came from ordinary people with practical grievances. The Kentish villages documented in the East Kent archives show tenant farming communities that continued to calculate quarterly rents on old calendar term days until the 1820s, nearly 70 years after the official transition. These communities had developed a local consensus that their lease agreements, signed before 1752, entitled them to old calendar dates regardless of what Parliament had decreed. Landlords who attempted to collect rent on new calendar quarter days in these communities faced organized resistance. The resistance was not violent, it was bureaucratic. Tenants presenting their original lease documents and demanding that the dates written in those documents be honored as written. Courts eventually ruled against them. But the process took decades, and in the interim, entire communities operated on a different calendar than the one the government recognized, paying taxes on new calendar dates when required to interact with official institutions, and paying rent on old calendar dates when they could get away with it. 2 calendars, 1 country, for 70 years. The British Calendar Act of 1750 solved a genuine problem. The Julian calendar was wrong. The 11-day correction was mathematically necessary. The Gregorian calendar is more accurate, and the world is better served by a shared international standard than by Protestant countries using one system and Catholic countries using another. All of that is true. It is also true that 11 days were deleted from the lives of millions of people without their consent, for reasons they were told were scientific, but which also happened to resolve financial ambiguities in ways that consistently favored landlords over tenants and creditors over debtors. It is true that the people who protested in 1752 and 1753 were not confused about dates. They were making specific legal arguments about specific financial losses, and those arguments were rejected by the institution that had caused the losses in the first place. It is true that parish registers across England and colonial America contain entries on dates that officially do not exist. September 7th, 1752, September 10th, 1752. Recorded by people who refused, quietly and in their own communities, to accept that a parliamentary act could delete the days of their lives from the record. It is true that the last English court case arguing a Julian calendar birth date was resolved in 1834, that people in Appalachian communities observed Old Christmas in living memory, that George Washington had 2 birthdays and chose the one Parliament preferred. And it is true that somewhere in a parish register in Virginia or Massachusetts or Kent, there is a record of a person born on September 8th, 1752, a date that does not exist, whose descendants have been trying to make sense of it ever since. 11 days were deleted. The people who lost them wrote about it, petitioned about it, went to court about it, refused to accept it for generations. The official record moved on. The parish registers remember.